Okay, today we're talking about imperialism and the Spanish-American War. This is our next topic for Module 1, Week 1, and happens to be one of my personal favorite topics of this time period because I just think that the way that it all develops is very interesting. We're still talking about the 1890s. When we started our class in 1877, kind of moved through, talked about race first, got some of the more difficult situations out there right away. And now we're going to talk about this concept of imperialism, which we'll define here in a moment. But we're in the 1890s. We're talking about how America continues to develop through this area. And you'll note as we go through Module 1 that basically what we're doing is we're talking about a lot of problems that are developing, a lot of issues that are coming up that we're going to have to deal with once we hit the 1900s. Note here that we have our identifications. You have 5 for this lecture: Hawaii, large policy, dollar diplomacy, open door diplomacy, Roosevelt corollary. Some of those we will talk about today. Others you'll need to look in your book for further information, so make sure that you're keeping up with those in order to be prepared for the exam. All right, so first we need to talk about what imperialism is. This 1890s period is what we call the age of imperialism, and imperialism refers to empire. It is acting as an empire. And so we define empire as one dominant country exerting political, economic, or social control over another country. Now, think way back to say like Rome and those types of countries. The way that they formed empires was through military conquering, right? They would take big armies and they would go through large sections of land and they would just conquer all of those people, and those people would become their subjects and part of the Roman Empire. This is not that kind of empire in the 1890s. It's a new way to exert political, economic, or social control over another, and it's focused in Africa. And so what European countries are doing, like Britain, like France, Portugal, Spain, what those countries are doing is they are going down into Africa, and they're kind of carving African countries or African territory up for themselves that they're going to control. They're not going to settle these areas, meaning people from Britain are not moving to Africa to live there, but they're going to control their political system, and they're going to control, most importantly, their resources. They're going to begin taking resources out of Africa and using them in their own trade. And so this is going to be very profitable for the European countries doing this. Of course, it's terrible for Africa. There will be huge repercussions for Africa later, but it's very successful for European countries. And so it's a new form of imperialism, using colonies for economic gain. Now, the United States is not participating in this in Africa because, in theory, the United States doesn't consider itself to be an empire. In fact, when it formed in 1776 and 1787, in that time period, we're forming our government, we are anti-empire. We're breaking away from Britain, who controlled us. We were British colonies. We're breaking away from them, and we don't want to be imperialistic, in theory. Now, as we'll see, we act very imperialistically. We have throughout our history, as we've taken over Native American land, as we've taken over Mexican land, as we've taken over, well, the things that we'll talk about today. We have acted repeatedly imperialistically, but we say that we're not. Okay, so it's like a little bit of a dichotomy in American culture. And so we're not participating in Africa because that would be too blatantly imperialistic. But the secret is that we're actually really jealous of what's happening in Africa because of the situation in the United States. See, instead of empire, we have the frontier, or we had the frontier. That's that open space of land beyond civilization, beyond settlement. It's the West. And all throughout the 1800s, we have been gradually settling the West. And that has sort of taken the place of empire overseas. Now, it's still imperialistic. I want to emphasize that the way that we take over the West is imperialistic. But we don't think of it that way. We think of it as our God-given territory in the West. But all of a sudden, in 1890, this guy named Frederick Jackson Turner, who's a historian and a writer, and he writes an article that says that the frontier is gone. The frontier has all been settled. The West is no longer the wild, wild West, but just other civilization, and that there's nothing left for America to conquer. And this is going to send us tumbling into this sort of pit of insecurity. What do we do now that we no longer have this area to conquer? And look, Europe is making use of Africa and getting all these great resources from there, and now we don't have anything. And so we're in a situation where we're very nervous about whether or not we're going to be able to continue to compete with Europe if our frontier is closed and their frontier is Africa. And so what we do is we start to think of ways that we could participate in some of this overseas imperialism without necessarily calling it that. And one of the first suggestions for how we should do this is something called the large policy. This is a political strategy proposed by the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt was a big supporter of the large policy. And the large policy is going to be the first step toward open imperialism in the United States. Basically, what it's going to do is it's going to demand the development of quote-unquote naval bases in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Naval bases is another word for colony. Basically, what the large policy says is we want to establish control over islands in places like the Caribbean and the Pacific so that we can have territories where we get resources and better fueling stops along our paths to bigger trade areas like China. Now, as we develop this large policy, initially it's not all that popular outside of the Republican Party and even within the Republican Party because it's very extreme. It basically, like I said, is calling for open imperialism, and we're not really sure how we feel about that. But then we get a situation that comes up that's going to test whether or not we really are willing to implement the large policy, and that's a situation with Hawaii. Now, as you know, Hawaii is in the Pacific Ocean, and for a very long time, since in the 1890s, for a very long time, we have had our eye on Hawaii as a place that has really great resources and a really great location. It's not part of the United States. Prior to 1898, it's independent, but we have a lot of business interests there. We have a lot of companies who have gone to Hawaii to use their resources and their labor, but they're American businesses. We specifically are interested in this area called Pearl Harbor, which we will obviously talk about later in our class when we get to World War II. So by 1887, we have a lot of business interests in Hawaii, but the Queen Liliuokalani, is not happy about this situation, and she tries to get rid of some of the American influence in Hawaii because she wants the Hawaiian resources to benefit primarily Hawaiians. So in response to this, there will be an overthrow. The business people, American business people, will stir up this uprising and overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and try to establish American control over this island. They will then propose to Grover Cleveland, who was president in 1893, they will propose that the United States annex Hawaii, meaning take it in, bring it in as part of American territory. Initially, Grover Cleveland resists this. He says, no, this is openly imperialistic. There's no way we can do that. This is not how we do things. But with the pressure to compete imperialistically with the support for the large policy that's increasing over the 1890s, by 1898, we will eventually agree to annex Hawaii, making it part of the United States. And this is really the first use of the large policy because we have this naval base, this quote-unquote colony in the Pacific Ocean. And so that sets the context for what's going to happen in Cuba, a Caribbean island. Now, Cuba has a complex history of its own, and it has been controlled for many, many years at this point by Spain. And they're continually fighting back against Spain, trying to overthrow these imperialistic overlords. Well, there's new trouble between Cuba and Spain in the 1890s, and they ask, Cuba asks U.S. people for help. That they need the United States to come down and help to overthrow Spain. And there's a lot of propaganda that's put out depicting the United States here. You can see as this hero. Cuba is the woman, and she's in desperate need. She's a damsel in distress. asking the United States for help against this evil villain of Spain. And propaganda like this really appealed to Americans because they're feeling a little bit like they need to be the big, powerful country again and exert their power. But we don't immediately go to war against Spain. We're considering this. We're still being very cautious up until 1898. So we have ships that are sort of patrolling Cuban waters and keeping an eye on things just to let everybody know that we are interested in this. Now, one of those ships is called the USS Maine. And while the USS Maine is in the Cuban harbor, it all of a sudden explodes in the waters. And immediately the American press begins to blame the Spanish. The Spanish have openly attacked an American ship. We have no choice but to declare war. McKinley, who was our president in 1898, William McKinley, he goes to Congress, asks them to declare war against Spain in retaliation for this terrible attack that has taken place. Now, we find out later, and probably they knew at the time, that the ship exploded because of an internal failure. Something went wrong with the wiring of the ship and exploded from the inside. There was no attack. But it was very convenient to use that event as a reason to declare war against Spain outside of just, well, we want Cuba. Now, Congress does declare war against Spain, but they're a little bit nervous because there are many people in Congress who still want to hold the United States back from imperialism, and they're worried that if we help Cuba defend against Spain, we will then take control of Cuba, which is what a lot of people want to do. But Congress is split on this. They're not sure that they want this to happen, and so they declare war, but with an amendment called the Teller Amendment in 1898. And that Teller Amendment says that Cuba will be guaranteed their freedom after the war. The United States will not retain control over them, and that helps to make anti-imperialists feel a little bit better about this upcoming war. Now, the war itself, the war against Spain, it's called the Spanish-American War. We're actually kind of just skipping right over it because it's a very short war. Some people call it the Splendid Little War. But we're going to skip it and talk about the fallout of it. Basically, we win the war. We kick the Spanish out of Cuba. We even managed to go over to the Philippines and kick the Spanish out of the Philippines, which is another one of their colonies, and we send Spain packing pretty quickly in about 4 months. It's what happens after the war that is going to be so significant for the direction that America is taking. So the peace treaty that ends the war is called the Treaty of Paris, and that happens in 1898 as well. And the Treaty of Paris basically gives the United States the Spanish colonies. That's the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and while Cuba is not exactly a colony, it also gives control of Cuba over to the United States. Now, this treaty, if we sign it, basically makes the United States an empire because we're taking on colonies. And that, theoretically, is the opposite of what the United States wants to do. And so Congress has the opportunity to review and either approve or deny this treaty and decide if we're going to become an official empire or not. Well, in 1898, they uphold the treaty and they begin to set up governments in the new colonies. And so it is at that moment that the United States becomes a colony-holding empire. Now, this contradicts the Teller Amendment because obviously now we're retaining control over Cuba. And so we passed the Platt Amendment in 1901 to address that. And the Platt Amendment says that Cuba is technically free, but the United States is going to control its economy, determine what treaties it can make with other countries, and set up its political system. But it's free. So again, on a technicality here, we're sort of getting what we want, but without calling it what it really is. And so in 1898, we become an empire. The thing that becomes a real issue after the Spanish-American War is the Philippines. If you remember, I said that during the war, we went over to the Philippines and kick the Spanish out of there. And initially, the Filipinos are really excited to see the United States and have us do that because they've been fighting against the Spanish for many, many years. And they're hoping that the United States will kick the Spanish out and then leave and they can be independent. But the United States is not going to do that. They're going to stay. And we're actually going to have a 3-year war against the Philippines. So even though the Spanish-American War ends in 1898, we're fighting to subdue the Philippines until 1902. So that's actually the most difficult part of the war. And there's a lot of conflict in the United States over, well, what should we do with the Philippines? They obviously want to be independent, and as Americans who believe in self-determination and independent government and democracy, shouldn't we give them their independence? And so a lot of people are concerned about that. But a lot of other people want the economic benefit that the Philippines is going to bring to us. It's a great location for trade and for resources. And so President McKinley goes to Congress and he says that he's had this big revelation about how to make this decision. He says there were 4 choices. Yeah, he could free them, but ultimately that would be terrible for the Filipinos, he says, because they're incapable of forming a government. You can see this propaganda picture over here. This is how the United States was portraying the Filipinos, as this child who is throwing a tantrum, unable to govern themselves. And so clearly they need the help and the guidance of Uncle Sam. He says that one option was to give them back to Spain, but that would be humiliating for the United States. He said he could give them to an ally, but why would we give our allies even more resources and more territory when they already have more than us? And so the only choice that was left was to colonize. And so this is the decision that he makes, is to colonize the Philippines and engage in this war to subdue them. Anti-imperialists are going to continue to protest in the United States, saying that this goes against self-determination, which is the philosophy that everybody should have the right to govern themselves. It goes against basic American values, and it's an invitation for conflict. But those anti-imperialist voices will very quickly fade out under the pressure of the American desire to expand and conquer. And so what we see in 1900 is the triumph of open imperialism. The United States becomes an open empire. And we can see this through a couple of different ways. McKinley is reelected in 1900, even though he is clearly the imperialist candidate running against the anti-imperialist candidate. The majority of Americans vote for McKinley, demonstrating that they are on board with his imperialistic agenda. And we had the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, given in 1904. Now, you can read more about this in your book. I'm just going to give you the basic idea of it here. But basically, in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine was passed, and it said that we would keep European imperialists out of Latin America, that we would interfere and keep them out. Well, the Roosevelt corollary is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. It says not only will we keep European countries out, but we will go down into Latin America and we will build up any Latin American country that's struggling in order to make them not as vulnerable to European invasion. Basically, what this does is it gives us the right to interfere in any Latin American country that we want to, and leads to decades of imperialistic activity in Latin America, which really damages our relationship with Latin America. And so the overall to this lesson, the summary here, is that this is how the United States becomes an open empire, by holding colonies and giving itself basically the right to interfere with the affairs of other countries. That happens from 1898 to 1901, 1902, about that area, and it's going to launch us into what we call the American century. Okay, so we'll stop there. Again, go back and go over the details of this in your book. Review the PowerPoints to get more